So my talk today will be, the picture you see here is disabled people who are on their way of the spot where they are going to take part in a demonstration. A demonstration against a measure of the government, budget cuts of the government, made by the government on support on disabled people. And that measure actually created a collective identity of disabled people, which was not, of course, identities are always in principle there, but they are not always salient. So what I want to do is to go through a whole lot of, let's say, what we know about identity, collective identity, politicized identity. One of the things that I've discovered gradually is that there's a lot of talk about identity, but very often it's not defined, let alone measured. So we are trying to do a little bit of both. Before I start, I want to say it's not the only factor that motivates people to take part in protest. There's three other concepts that are important in our work. Instrumentality, people act because they want to change their circumstances, and I believe that taking part in action would be instrumental for that. Ideological, people take part in protest because they want to express their view, they want to make known their view, and then there's of course emotions that play an important role. I want to do four things, but I may not be able to do all four. To discuss the concept of politicized collective identity, I want to say something about causality, what comes first, identity and then participation, or participation and then identity. Then I want to say something about multiple identities, and if we have time, I want to say a few things about radicalization. A few things about identity. Identity basically begins with a place in society, and it can be many different places. Can be a role, like a professor, can be membership of a category, like a Dutch citizen. And you can think of hundreds of more roles or categories that you are part of. Some of those roles, some of those categories are salient as an identity, but many of them are not and never become salient. There's a difference between personal identity, social identity, and collective identity. Personal identity is all the roles and all the positions I have, and my awareness of that. That creates my personal identity. Social identity is a part of it. It's that part of my identity that is related to the groups I am a member of. So part of my identity is related to the fact that I am a member of the sociology department at Free University, right? So, and usually people want to take some pride in the groups they are members of. Collective identity is, and I'm deliberately using the word cognitions with all those identities. Identities are social constructions. On the one hand, they are given, but on the other hand, they are there in people's mind. And the impact they have is very much dependent on the way they are in people's mind. Collective identity is cognitions about a role or a position that I share with other people. In fact, almost all positions we are taking are shared with other people. I'm not the only professor, I'm not the only Dutch, I'm not the only citizen of Amsterdam, and you can make the list as long as you want. All those positions I share with other people. And finally there's group identification. That's to what extent am I committed to a specific group. As I already said, many collective identities are not salient. Salient in the sense that that I'm aware of it and that they are having an impact on my behavior. Some are, and politicized identities necessarily are salient identities. And a politicized identity is a collective identity when people take action related to an identity they share. So it's politicization is, so not all identities are salient, and certainly not all identities are politicized. And politicization is a process. The process begins with awareness of shared grievances. So, as a university professor, I might be aware of the fact that our government is cutting our salaries, and that may become the beginning of a process of politicization. Next step is that there is some actor, most of the time governments, that is blamed for the grievance that we have. And then we try to change or to influence that actor, and that actor can then be more or less prepared to take any action and to change its policy. When government is not coming forward with some how do you call that, measures to change its policy, the process of politicization further continues. The general public becomes involved in it, and gradually it restructures society into opponents and allies. So it no longer is my government or is a political party or whatever kind of a neutral instance, it becomes either an ally or an opponent. And we try to reformulate the claims and the issues and the grievances such that our allies can actually commit to our goals. So we try in trying to, and I think Donatella used earlier this morning, making it more general. That's actually what is taking place. So, as a university professor, I'm no longer complaining about my salary, but I'm complaining about the quality of university education, which is a much broader. And then, of course, our opponents say, well, you're not interested in the quality of education, you just want to raise your salary. So that's the... Okay, about causality. There's two questions that can be raised when it concerns causality. The one is what's here on the screen. The role identification plays in processes of convincing and activating. A very important part in social movement mobilization is what you could call consensus mobilization, trying to persuade people that to take your views. Obviously, identification plays an important role in the effectiveness of those processes. So you could basically argue that if you think in terms of mobilization, movement mobilization, the social movement organization is not the only actor that is trying to convincing people. There's many more actors that are trying to convince, and the claims of social movement organizations are by definition controversial. So there will always be other actors in society that try to convince that the view of the movement organization is wrong or falsified or whatever. In that setting, identification is of crucial significance, and you can sort of imagine why. The more people identify with an actor, the more they are inclined to subscribe to that actor's viewpoint. You're inclined to believe the persons and the people and the organizations you feel committed to. Thus, calls for action resonate more among people who identify with the organizers. It's not a very complicated process, but it is the way it works. To give you an example of this, this is 2 demonstrations in Amsterdam at the same day. They are demonstrations against plans of the government with regard to early retirement. Two different demonstrations against the same government measurement. The top one is at the Dam Square, is by an anti-neoliberal reform movement, a more ideological movement. The lower one, with the biggest crowd, is organized by the labor unions. The one to the left, the labor unions want to become involved again in the negotiations with the government. The government gave up negotiating with them, and they are there to put pressure on government. The other one is the neoliberal, anti-neoliberal organization. They are more ideologically motivated, and our expectation is that depending on how much people identify with the one or the other organizer, that they are more inclined to take either the ideological or the instrumental path. And that's indeed what we find. So the black one, so this is, to what extent are people ideologically motivated? And you see that the people who identify with the anti-neoliberal organization are much more convinced or motivated by ideological motivations than the people from the unions. If you look at the instrumental motivation, you see just the opposite pattern. So the people who identify with the unions are much more instrumentally motivated than the people who do not identify with the unions. So identification is a very important process element in processes of convincing people, and convincing people is a very elementary process in mobilization. The most general and most often researched hypothesis with regard to identification is that people who identify with the organizers are more likely to take part in the activities, and that begins with the moment that people decide to take part. This is data from a demonstrations study that we are conducting these days. 60 demonstrations in 7 different countries. Yeah, in the meantime, it's 9, but there's 7 here. 13,000 participants. And we asked these people, when did you decide to go to the demonstration? Over a month ago, a few weeks before, a few days before, and the very day of the demonstration. And our expectation is that the more people identify, the earlier they take the decision to take part. And that's what we found. This is a result from a regression analysis. Important factor is social embeddedness. To what extent are people embedded in networks and organizations, which is obviously important when it comes to the time of the decision, but both identification measures do play a significant role. So the more people identify with an organizer, the earlier they decide to take part in the demonstration. And the timing of that decision is an important element of an important motivational proxy. So identification with organizers makes people more susceptible to the frames propagated by those organizers. And identification with the organizers make people decide earlier to take part in collective action. 3 minutes, okay, we have still 50 minutes to go. Okay, so to the next step in the reasoning about causality. It's the question that I phrased already. But what comes first, identification or participation? And it's important to understand that participation presupposes the possibility to participate. So if you can ask people to what extent do you identify with this organization, to what extent would you be prepared to take part in collective action, as long as there's no opportunity to take part in collective action, it will never get beyond the point of preparedness. These are data from a study among farmers in Spain and the Netherlands, at 3 points in time, and this is results from a cross-legged analysis, and what you see here is that identification at time 1 is much better as a predictor of preparedness at time 3 than preparedness at time 1 of identification at time 3. So it goes from identification to preparedness, right? If you look at identification and participation, it's obvious that identification is much worse as a predictor of participation than participation is as a predictor of identification. So you participate and become more identified, rather than you identify and that makes you participate. The reason why is the fact that preparedness, if there's no preparedness, there's no collective action. So at time 1, preparedness is much better in predicting participation at time 3 than that participation at time 3, that's a typo, is able to predict participation at time 1 is able to predict preparedness at time 3. So the way it goes is you identify with an organization that mobilizes. Because you identify, you're prepared to take part. Because you're prepared to take part, you take part, and that makes that your identification increases again. So it's what you were talking about this morning. The act of participating, being involved in, has an impact on the cognitions of participants. So, conclusion of this part: collective identity fosters action preparedness fosters action participation strengthens collective identity. The interesting element of that is that to get from preparedness or to get from identification to higher identification, you need those 2 steps in between. People need to be prepared, but especially they need to participate. And if there's no opportunity to participate, then nothing will happen. Multiple identities, as I said, people occupy many different positions and places in society. And that raises questions like, why do specific identities become rallying point of protest movements? And here we go again. At the root of any protest are shared grievances. And awareness of shared grievances makes a collective identity salient and attempts to mobilize people makes that those who share grievances become more aware of the fact that they share those grievances. And grievances may involve single or multiple identities. The one I started with, the disabled people, is a typical example of a single identity. So people are mobilized on that single aspect of their identity. A multiple identity or protest related to a multiple identity is, for example, peace protest or anti-war protest. There's no specific collective identity related to claims regarding to peace or war. Even the computer tells me that we can't go on anymore. Okay. What shall I do?
Arrows?
Yeah, I'm using the arrows.
Yeah. If it doesn't work, that's the end of the presentation.
Yeah, that's what. That's what I was saying. Even the computer is telling me that I should stop. Okay. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, I'll try to come to a conclusion. Okay, so briefly, one example of a single identity single identity protest research among Turkish and Moroccan people. What is important is on the figures, 60% of these people are members of social organizations and 31% are members of an identity organization. An identity organization in this respect is a Turkish cultural organization or a Moroccan organization. So if we ask them, did you take part in protest in the past, then you see that of the people who were not member of any organization, only 25% takes part in protest. Of the people who are member of an organization, 50% takes part in protest. And of the people who are member of an identity organization, 60% takes part in protest. And the other three columns are trying to understand why. First of all, there's a correlation. The correlation between unfairness and future participation is higher among the people who are member of identity organizations. So the relationship between grievances and participation is stronger. That's partly because they feel that they are more effective. The correlation between efficacy and future participation is highest among people who are members of identity organizations. The reason why could be that people talk about politics in organizations they are members of, and that's what the last column is about. We ask people to what extent do you discuss politics with your friends and with people in organizations you are a member of, and what you see is that correlation is far highest in the identity organizations group. I'm finished this one, and then I have finished the first half, but then I will stop. An example of a multiple identity protest is, like I said already, the war in the demonstrations against the war in Iraq. There's no single identity that is relevant except perhaps, and that's what we were looking into, except perhaps the political identity people have. And political identity you could define in at least our part of the world in being left or being right. To what extent do people identify with the left, or political left, or the political right? And a famous question for political scientists is, if you were to place yourself on a scale from 0 to 10, 0 is left and 10 is right, where would you place yourself? This is a comparison between participants in the demonstration and the general population. So to what extent are people who are politically left overrepresented in the group of participants? And what you would expect, and which is not very spectacular, that all the people who are in that demonstration, the demonstration has a heavy overrepresentation of leftist people. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. 5 minutes for the question.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to ask you about your three-dimensional modeling, identical, factor, ideological, and instrumental. Did you consider social networks? I mean, just ties between friends, because for instance, our case shows that it's enormously important. As Ivan said, still observes movement was like fashion. Just people come with friends to elections. Or for instance, it's suitable not only for our protests. For instance, Mark Adam, analyzing civil rights movement, he stated the same claim. Social networks, just 2 years, matters more than ideology. People who have many friends inside the movement become activists. People who have just a few friends inside the movement, but many friends outside the movement become disruptors.
Yeah, sure. No, it's where is it here? This is a clear example of the significance of being involved or being embedded in social networks or organizations. That people who are not member of an organization can really mean any kind of organization. Can be religious, can be political, can be sports, can be culture, can also movement organizations. And it's very obvious that people who are not members of any of those organizations are participating much less in this case in political action of immigrants than people who are members of organizations. And you will find the same. I skipped one of the tables of the farmers. Where is that? Oops. No, it's no longer there. Anyway, but I had the table, but that's no longer there, of the farmers' protest, and farmers who are members of farmers' organizations are much more participating in political protests related to being a farmer than farmers who are not.
Another question? Karina?
Thank you very much. Having in mind the very problematic feature of collective identities in Russia, what do you think? Is it possible for you for a process of politicization occurring without process of collective identification?
Can you say it again and a little bit louder? I missed.
Is it possible for you that a process of politicization occurs without any process of collective identification?
Okay. Yeah. I would be inclined to say no. Politicization, radicalization is, in my view, a collective process. So you don't radicalize, you don't politicize on your own. It's always you're part of a group of people, and it's in many respects, at least the way I see it, it's a group process. So the group of people you are part of is radicalizing or is politicizing. You could decide that you don't want to go on with that process. You could decide that you don't want to be politicized, or you don't want to radicalize that much. But I don't think that people radicalize on every now and then. There might be, but the general process in my view is that both politicization and radicalization are group processes. That's.
Thank you. As a question.
Great. If you don't mind, last two questions.
Well,
short. But, yes, it's actually a question that continues the line of question already present, but about the size of the concept of identity, because you initially suggested that identity is not the only factor motivating people's participation in political action. You listed the others, emotional ideology and something else that I forgot. But then you went on to give the example of protests, Dutch protests against the Italian state, in which you suggested, one identity is based on moral ideology, another identity is based more on pure instrumental gain. And so, from this example, it seems to me that your concept of identity is an overarching one, includes all these three emotions, instrumentality, and ideology. So is identity an overarching concept that includes all these others, in which case it might be a little bit big. It's a concept. And my other question has to do, with an American context, in which there is a hardline argument that identity struggles in the 60s were progressive and emancipatory. But lately, identity has become much more defined with consumption, and so the identity struggles which had been progressive and immensely, we really had lost the immensity, the contents. Do you, which is an attempt to historicize the role of identity in social movements. Do you agree with this argument? And if not, what would your historicization of the role of identity in social movements would be?
Okay, well, to start with the first question, what I was referring to is processes of communication and persuasion, right? So people are more inclined to be persuaded by a source of information they identify with. So if it's the labor union, and if I identify with the labor union, I trust it as a source of communication, as a source of information, so I'm more inclined to believe what they say than some other actors who are trying to disseminate a different view. I'm not necessarily saying that identification or identity is more important than the other motivations. So people who are more trustful with regard to the labor unions in that specific research are more likely to be persuaded by instrumental argumentation. So so you have to think of that in terms of a communication and persuasion process. The way I look at identity in the context of those other instrumentality, ideology, and emotions, it starts, like I said, it starts with shared grievances. But to be able to have shared grievances, you need people to identify with. So so in the process of discovering that you and I have share the same grievances, we start also to identify. So identification is a central process in my view that defines with which group of people do I identify with, and if that group of people is hurt or affected by some governmental measure, we share a grievance, and that makes us makes our identity politicized. Yeah?
Sorry, can I just say sorry from the side of organizers, because Bert asked for more time for presentation. I personally promised to give, and then just I didn't notice some sporadic changes in program, and I didn't know that, so the Bert's time was reduced, so sorry, it's my fault.
Okay. So anyway, we need to proceed. Thank you very much for this very interesting report.